Richard Davenport stood behind the polished counter of his high-end boutique, surveying the store with a practiced eye. The marble floors gleamed under the soft, warm light, and the elegant shelves filled with luxurious goods were neatly arranged, each piece more exquisite than the last. Everything in the store exuded wealth and exclusivity, from the intricately designed products to the sleek, modern aesthetic. As the owner, Richard took great pride in the image he had carefully cultivated over the years. The store was his empire, a symbol of his success and status. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back with precision. Every detail of his appearance screamed power. But it wasn't just his outward appearance that commanded attention. Richard had a way of carrying himself, a quiet arrogance that made everyone who entered his store immediately aware of who was in control. He moved through his space like a king, walking with an air of superiority that kept any notion of equality at bay. His mind was focused on the upcoming business deal that would solidify his position in the upper echelons of the city's elite. He had plans, big plans, and nothing was going to stop him from achieving his goals. He often considered himself untouchable, above the petty concerns of the world around him. After all, who would dare challenge someone like him? It was at that very moment that the door to his store opened, the soft bell chiming as it swung wide. Richard didn't even look up at first, assuming it was just another well-dressed customer ready to indulge in luxury. But when he heard the faint shuffle of worn shoes across the floor, his attention snapped toward the door. A woman stood there, her eyes cast downward, her face pale and gaunt from hunger. She wore a faded dress that hung loosely from her frail frame, and her hair, unkempt and tangled, framed a face that showed the toll of hardship. Richard's eyes narrowed as she stepped inside, glancing around at the display with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. She wasn't someone who belonged here, Richard thought. She wasn't part of his world. The woman took a few tentative steps further into the store, her hands nervously clutching the straps of an old, worn bag. Richard's gaze flicked over her once more, his lips curling into a slight sneer. She looked out of place, like a stain on the otherwise pristine walls of his boutique. "Can I help you?" Richard's voice was cold, his tone calculated. There was no warmth in his words, no real invitation. He only asked out of politeness, something he had been taught, but never truly practiced. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. I'm looking for work. A job, perhaps. I can do anything. Anything you need." Richard raised an eyebrow, his gaze briefly flicking over her ragged appearance. "Work?" He scoffed, the sound sharp and dismissive. "You're not exactly what I'm looking for. We don't hire people like you here." The word stung, but the woman didn't flinch. She could tell by the way he spoke, disdainful, condescending, that she wasn't welcome. But she couldn't afford to walk away. Not now. Not when she was so close. Her child was waiting outside, and she needed to find something to feed him, even if it was just a few crumbs. "Please," she continued, her voice more desperate now. "I just need something, anything. I'll clean, I'll organize, just, please." Richard's eyes flashed with annoyance. He took a step toward her, the sound of his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, further emphasizing the divide between them. "You think you can just walk into my store and beg for a job? This is a place for people who know how to contribute, not for," he trailed off, his eyes moving over her dirty clothes with a sneer. "People like you." The woman's shoulders slumped. She had hoped, foolishly, that maybe there was kindness left in the world. But she had been wrong. He wasn't going to help her. In fact, he was about to make things worse. Richard's patience had run out. Without warning, he took a step back and pointed toward the door with a sharp motion. "Get out of my store. I don't have time to waste on the likes of you." The woman stood frozen, her heart racing, her mind reeling. She had nowhere else to turn. Desperation clawed at her throat, but she couldn't bring herself to beg. Not like this. Not when he had already decided she was unworthy of even a scrap of his attention. Slowly, she backed away, not even daring to look at him as she turned and walked out the door. Her footsteps were faint as she crossed the threshold, the cold air from the outside seeping in as she disappeared into the world beyond. Richard watched her leave, feeling no remorse. She was nothing. A fleeting inconvenience. He didn't even give her a second thought as he turned back to his business, focusing once more on the deals he had to close. Hours passed, but Richard could not shake the unease that had settled in his chest. He tried to focus on his meetings and finalize the deals that would further cement his place at the top, but his mind kept wandering back to the woman, the starving mother who had dared to ask him for help. He had dismissed her, of course. That was what people like her deserved, wasn't it? But something about the desperation in her eyes had stuck with him. He brushed the thought aside, attributing it to the fact that she had been an unfortunate interruption in his otherwise well-ordered life. As the day drew to a close, Richard felt the weight of the evening's silence settling in the store. The lights dimmed to give the boutique a more intimate feel, a sharp contrast to the busy bustle of the afternoon. He moved toward the back office, where his assistant was waiting to finalize some paperwork. Just as he was about to step inside, the doorbell chimed again. Richard paused, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the entrance. To his surprise, it was the woman. She stood at the doorway, her body slightly bent forward as if the wind had taken all her strength. She was still wearing the same ragged dress, her shoes caked with dirt. She looked like she had walked miles just to stand in front of him. "What are you doing back here?" Richard's voice was sharp, almost incredulous. "I told you to leave. I don't have time for you." The woman took a hesitant step forward. She didn't respond immediately, instead looking down at her hands, wringing them together nervously. Richard raised an eyebrow, his patience thinning. "What is it? Come to beg some more?" She didn't respond to that either. Instead, she slowly raised her gaze to meet his, her eyes tired but unwavering. "I'm not asking for a job anymore," she said quietly, her voice low but steady. "I'm asking for help." Richard took a step back, his irritation boiling over. "Help? I've already helped you. I showed you the door. What more do you want from me?" "I know you think I'm just nothing," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not. And neither is my son. I didn't come here for a handout. I just need someone to care. Just for once." Richard stared at her, the words cutting through the air like a slap. He didn't know what to say. The words nothing and care echoed in his mind, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt something stir inside him, something he had buried deep beneath layers of cold indifference. But no, he couldn't let it in. He couldn't let her words get to him. He was a businessman, not a charity. He had no place for compassion in his life. He turned his back on her, ready to retreat into the comfort of his office. "You've had your chance," Richard snapped, not bothering to look at her. "Now leave before I call security." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She had come here, once again, in desperation. But she was not about to beg. She had dignity, even if Richard couldn't see it. And so, with a final, slow exhale, she made her decision. She turned and walked toward the door, but before she reached it, she stopped. She couldn't leave. Not like this. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go, but this store, this place that had promised to hold answers, had only brought her more pain. With her back to Richard, she spoke softly but with authority. "You might think that I'm nothing," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest, "but you'll see. You'll see that I'm more than just a woman in rags. You'll see that I have the power to make you understand what it means to be truly helpless." Richard froze. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, he found himself staring at the door. What was she implying? Was it a threat? He couldn't fathom how someone like her could have the power to affect his life in any meaningful way. He brushed the thought aside, trying to dismiss her words. He was still the one in control. "Goodbye," Richard muttered, his voice harsh, his back still turned. Maria didn't respond. She simply walked out, her shoulders squared with the weight of the world upon them. The door swung shut behind her, and the soft click echoed through the empty space, as if sealing the moment into Richard's memory. Richard didn't realize it then, but that was the moment when everything began to unravel. Later that night, as Richard sat in his office reviewing documents, a phone call interrupted his thoughts. His assistant's voice crackled through the line, and she sounded frantic. "Mr. Davenport, there's been a problem. A major one. You need to get down here, right now." Richard's heart skipped a beat. He immediately stood, his instincts kicking in. "What's happened?" "It's the deal with Blackstone Industries. It's fallen through. They've pulled out." Richard's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, they've pulled out?" "We had an agreement." "I don't know what happened, sir. But they've canceled everything. They've put a hold on all transactions, and we're in danger of losing the entire investment." Richard's mind raced as he paced across the office. Blackstone Industries was the cornerstone of his company's future. Without that deal, everything he had worked for could collapse in an instant. But how? How had this happened so suddenly? "I'm coming," Richard snapped, his mind already calculating the next steps. He didn't have time to think about Maria or the strange way she had spoken to him. He had to focus. He had to fix this. But as he headed out of his office, the words Maria had spoken earlier haunted him. "You'll see that I'm more than just a woman in rags." What did she mean by that? And why did it feel like her words had some hidden weight to them? Richard arrived at his office, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt such a rush of urgency before. Blackstone Industries, the deal that would elevate him to a new level of success, was slipping through his fingers. He could hear his assistant's voice echoing in his mind. "The deal has fallen through. We're in danger of losing everything." As he strode into his office, he could see the tension on his assistant's face. She was standing near the desk, her hands shaking slightly as she handed him a document. "We've tried everything, Mr. Davenport. I've contacted everyone I could think of, but it's too late. The board has made their decision." Richard snatched the document from her hand, his eyes scanning the words rapidly. His mind raced as he read the message from Blackstone Industries. They were withdrawing from the deal, citing reasons Richard couldn't have predicted. The financial markets were in turmoil, they said. They were shifting focus to other investments. But Richard knew it was more than that. Someone had to have made a move behind the scenes. Someone had to have manipulated the situation. He dropped the paper onto the desk, his frustration bubbling over. How could this happen? I'm not going to let this ruin everything I've built. There has to be a way to fix this. He ran his fingers through his hair, pacing back and forth. The assistant looked helpless, her eyes darting nervously. "I don't know, sir. They've completely pulled out. And they're threatening to expose internal dealings that could harm our reputation." Richard's pulse quickened. This was no longer just about money, it was about survival. His empire, the one he had carefully constructed over the years, was teetering on the brink of collapse. "Then we fight," he said, his voice cold with determination. "I'll take care of the details. You contact our legal team. We'll stop this from happening." He had no time to waste. As he made his way out of the office, he glanced at the clock on the wall. The night was creeping in, and with it, the pressure to save everything he had worked for. But even as he prepared to fight for his company's future, a thought lingered in the back of his mind. Maria. The woman he had rejected earlier. She had come back to him, not asking for charity, but asking for help. Her words echoed in his mind, "You'll see that I'm more than just a woman in rags." Richard pushed the thought aside as he grabbed his coat and headed out into the night. There was no room for distractions. He had to focus. There was too much at stake. Hours passed as Richard met with his legal team, spoke with contacts at Blackstone, and made phone calls to everyone who could help him regain control of the situation. He didn't stop until the early hours of the morning, when he finally collapsed into a chair, exhausted but determined. But despite all his efforts, nothing had worked. The deal with Blackstone was officially dead, and now the weight of the situation began to sink in. The reputation of his company was in tatters. Richard had never been so close to losing everything. He couldn't help but think of Maria again. What if she had been right? What if there was something he had missed, something he hadn't seen? He had dismissed her so easily, but perhaps, in her desperation, she had seen something in him that he couldn't recognize in himself. The hours dragged on as Richard sat in the dim light of his office, staring at the stack of documents in front of him. Every passing minute felt like a countdown to his downfall. And then, just as he was about to call it a night, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something inside him told him to pick it up. "Mr. Davenport?" A woman's voice crackled on the other end of the line. He sat up straighter. "Who is this?" "It's Maria," she said. "I think you need to listen to what I have to say." Richard's heart skipped a beat. "Maria? What do you want?" "I told you that I could help you," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "And I meant it." Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. How did she know about the deal? Did she know something he didn't? "What do you know?" he demanded, leaning forward in his chair. "Enough," she said. "But you need to meet me. Now. There's still a chance for you, but it's not going to be easy. And it's going to cost you." Richard's mind raced. He was out of options, and this woman, this mother who had nothing, was offering him the only lifeline he had. He felt the weight of his pride begin to crumble. He had no choice. "Where?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll send you the details. You need to be there within the hour. Don't make me wait." Richard hung up the phone, his thoughts swirling. What was he doing? He was a millionaire, a man who had built his empire on his own. He had never needed anyone's help. But now, he was about to meet a woman he had dismissed like a pest, and he had to trust her. He had no choice. Richard stared at his phone for a moment, the screen still showing the call from Maria. His mind buzzed with thoughts, each one racing faster than the last. Every part of him screamed to turn away, to forget about her and focus on salvaging what was left of his empire. But deep down, he knew he had no choice. His wealth, his reputation, everything was crumbling around him. And the woman he had so callously dismissed, the woman whose words had haunted him all evening, was now his only hope. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his steps quick but heavy with reluctance. He couldn't believe what he was about to do. The rich, powerful Richard Davenport, about to meet a woman he had dismissed as unworthy, was that the man he had become? Outside, the city streets were quiet, the noise of the day replaced by the stillness of the night. The lights of the city flickered like distant stars, illuminating the path ahead, but Richard wasn't paying attention to the scenery. He was consumed by the thought of the meeting ahead. His car sped through the streets, the tires humming against the asphalt, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about his upbringing, the sacrifices he had made, the bridges he had burned, all for what? So that he could stand at the top, above everyone else, above people like Maria. He had always thought that people like her were beneath him, that their struggles were their own fault. They hadn't worked hard enough, hadn't been smart enough. But now, as the weight of his situation bore down on him, he wondered if he had been wrong. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out, seeing a message from Maria. "Address is on your way. Hurry." Richard gritted his teeth. He didn't like being dictated to, didn't like having to follow orders from someone who had no claim to power. But again, what choice did he have? He had to meet her. He had to find out what she knew. The car pulled up in front of an old building, its stone exterior worn and withered. The lights inside were dim, and the whole place looked like it had been forgotten by time. Richard hesitated for a moment before getting out, the night air biting at his skin. He looked up at the building, wondering what sort of world he was about to step into. Inside, the air smelled musty, and the faint hum of a broken air conditioner could be heard in the distance. Richard followed the directions Maria had given him, his footsteps echoing off the walls as he moved through the narrow hallway. The building was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. As he reached the door she had mentioned, he paused, taking a deep breath. Then he knocked. The door creaked open, revealing Maria standing on the other side. She looked exactly as she had earlier, worn, tired, but somehow stronger than she had been before. Her expression was unreadable, and she stood there for a moment, just looking at him. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off before he could say anything. "Come in," she said, her voice steady and calm. He stepped inside, feeling the tension in the air. The room was small, furnished with simple, functional pieces. A single table in the center, a chair pushed against the wall. It was nothing like the elegant, polished spaces Richard was used to. It was raw, real, and in that moment, it made him feel like an outsider. Maria closed the door behind him and gestured to the chair across from the table. "Sit down." Richard did as he was told, his mind still spinning with a mix of frustration and curiosity. Maria walked over to a small counter where a few mugs were set out, and she poured him a cup of tea. The action was simple, but it felt strange, as if the ordinary task carried a significance he couldn't quite place. "Why am I here?" Richard finally asked, his voice laced with impatience. Maria sat down across from him, placing the tea in front of him but not moving to sit herself. She folded her hands in front of her, her eyes meeting his directly. "You're here because you need help. And I'm here because I can offer it." Richard scoffed, his pride pushing back. "I don't need charity from anyone. Not from you." Maria's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a solution." Richard stared at her, his thoughts racing. What could this woman possibly know that would help him? She wasn't a businesswoman. She wasn't someone with connections in the upper echelons of the corporate world. She was a mother struggling to survive. "You don't get it, do you?" Maria continued, her voice soft but firm. "You think this is about money, about deals. But it's not. It's about power. And right now, you're powerless." Richard felt a cold chill run through him. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny it, but her words struck a chord deep inside him. He had built his life on control, on dominance, on being the one who made the decisions. But now, here he was, sitting in a room that felt alien, with a woman who had no reason to care about his problems. "People like me," she continued, "know what it's like to be powerless. But we also know how to find strength in places you can't even imagine." Richard's heart skipped a beat as the full weight of her words hit him. He had never understood people like Maria. He had never bothered to understand them. But now, sitting in front of her, he saw something different. A quiet strength, a resilience he hadn't known existed. "You have something I need," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You have the resources to fix what's broken. But you've also made enemies. And the people you've trusted, they're the ones who will bring you down." Richard swallowed hard. She was right. The walls were closing in on him, and it was his own arrogance that had put him in this position. His trust had been misplaced, and now, the people he had once relied on were turning against him. Maria reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward him. "Here's what I can offer. A way out. But it's going to cost you." Richard's eyes flicked to the folder Maria had placed before him. It was ordinary, unassuming, but the weight of what it contained was enough to make his pulse quicken. He could feel the sweat gathering on the back of his neck, the tension thick in the air. He hesitated, unsure whether to open the folder, unsure whether to trust her. "You know, you're not the first person to come to me for help," Maria said quietly, almost as if reading his thoughts. "But you might be the first who actually needed it." Richard took a breath, his mind spinning. How had he gotten here? How had he gone from the top of the world to sitting across from a woman who had nothing, and yet somehow seemed to have more control than he did? "I can't afford to make mistakes anymore," Richard finally said, his voice low, his usual bravado slipping away. What's in this folder, Maria? How can it help me? Maria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood and walked over to the small table by the window, her movements deliberate. Richard watched her, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She had him here, at her mercy. He didn't like it. She turned to face him, her eyes calm but firm. It's simple, really, she said. You're not going to fix this by playing the game you've always played. You've been using people, manipulating situations. But the people you've relied on are turning against you. They're ready to watch you fail. Richard's jaw tightened. So what do you expect me to do? He asked, the words sharp with impatience. Beg? Grovel for mercy? Maria's lips curved into a slight smile, though there was no malice in it. No. I expect you to think differently. What I'm offering you is a way to get ahead. It's a way to flip the tables. But it's not free. Richard's heart raced as she stepped forward, holding his gaze. What do you want from me? He asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. Maria looked at him with steady eyes. Your humility, she said. I want you to recognize that there's more to life than power, than wealth. You've spent your whole life building walls around yourself, Richard. But now, they're crumbling. And the only way to stop it is to tear down your own walls. Richard's throat felt tight. The words hit him harder than he expected. How could she ask him to do that? How could he give up everything he had worked for? He had been ruthless, focused only on the prize. Now, he was being asked to change. His mind raced, the fear of losing everything, his company, his reputation, his pride, clashing with the faint flicker of hope that Maria offered. He could feel it, deep inside, that shift. That sense that maybe she was right. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice soft now, almost vulnerable. Maria met his gaze, her expression unwavering. Because I know what it's like to fight for something. To fight for survival. And I know that you, deep down, are more than just your money. You have the ability to change. But you have to choose. Richard's mind swirled with emotions, resentment, pride, fear, but also something new, a deep, gnawing need to prove himself. To himself, if no one else. He opened the folder slowly, the papers inside seeming so much heavier than they should have been. The details were clear. What she was offering, and out, was real. She had the connections to make everything right. But at a cost, Richard had to relinquish control. He had to trust her, trust that she knew what was best. It felt like everything he had ever known was slipping away. For a moment, Richard simply stared at the papers. Then, slowly, with a deep breath, he slid the folder aside and looked up at Maria. I'll do it, he said quietly, his voice shaky but determined. I'll trust you. Maria's eyes softened slightly. You're making the right choice. The silence between them hung heavy, but for the first time, it felt like Richard wasn't drowning in it. For the first time, he felt like he was making a choice that wasn't driven by fear. He had fought so hard to build his life around control, around wealth. But now, in this moment, he was willing to break that mold and try something different. He was choosing to trust. Thank you, he said, his voice steadier now. Maria nodded, her face serious. Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. You'll have to work hard, and you'll have to prove yourself. This isn't easy. But you have the chance to rebuild. Not just your business, but yourself. Richard sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling over him. It wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't sure how it would play out, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Maria had shown him a glimpse of something beyond the material. She had shown him that it was possible to rebuild if he was willing to change. I'll remember this, he said finally, his voice quieter now, but filled with conviction. I won't forget what you've done. Maria smiled faintly, her expression softening. Just make sure you don't forget yourself. You're capable of more than you think. Richard watched her as she stood up, the room now feeling different. Lighter. He felt the weight of his previous arrogance slipping away. It wasn't gone completely, he knew that would take time, but it was a start. He had taken the first step toward a new future. A future that wasn't built on arrogance, on crushing others to get ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Richard believed in that future.